Welcome back to The Apprentice and the Hunter. This is episode 2, The Haunted Villa. Join Ethan and Gabriel as they respond to a desperate call for help from a wealthy man whose new villa harbors a dark, malevolent spirit. Will they manage to contain the evil within, or will they become the next victims? Like, share, and subscribe to follow their journey as they face even more horrifying encounters. New episodes drop every week, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. The morning sun filtered through the gap in the curtains, casting a soft glow over Ethan's face. He turned over, attempting to go back to sleep, but the unease inside him made it impossible to rest. He had been following Gabriel for a while now, and although he'd encountered supernatural events before, this mission felt different. It would be his first time facing a true haunting. The night before, Gabriel had received an urgent letter from a man named Jonathan Blake, a wealthy businessman. Jonathan had recently purchased a luxury villa in the countryside, and at first, he believed he had realized a lifelong dream. But soon after moving in, strange occurrences began to plague his family and staff, events that quickly turned his dream into a nightmare. In the letter, Jonathan described the unsettling occurrences in disturbing detail. It started with the servants. They began complaining about hearing whispers at night, seeing dark shadows moving through the rooms. Then it escalated to Jonathan's family. Even his 3-year-old son fell ill, the doctors unable to find any explanation. The servants began to quit, and soon, no one dared to work in the house. Frightened by the worsening situation, Jonathan's wife took their son to her family's home, leaving him alone in the villa. At first, Jonathan didn't believe in the supernatural. He assumed it was stress or imagination. But then the nightmares began. He described in the letter how he was being attacked by a ghost, a man who stood by his bed every night, shouting at him to leave, claiming the house was his. Each night, Jonathan woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like he was being strangled, and the bruises around his neck grew deeper. Although there were no physical lash marks on his body, he felt the pain of being beaten. Jonathan had been driven to desperation, and so he reached out to Gabriel. Ethan recalled how Gabriel had reacted with his usual calm, almost emotionless expression when he read the letter. To him, this seemed like just another case. But for Ethan, it stirred a sense of unease. This was different from the minor hauntings they dealt with before. This was a real hunt. Ready? Gabriel stood by the door, his voice steady as always. His bag, filled with his usual hunting tools, was slung over his shoulder, simple yet effective. Ethan nodded. Though filled with questions and anxiety, he knew there was no turning back. This was part of his path toward becoming a hunter. The two of them boarded a train heading to the countryside, and after a few hours of travel, they arrived at the station where Jonathan had arranged to meet them. Jonathan was already there, waiting outside, looking even more exhausted than Ethan had imagined. Though dressed in a sharp suit, the dark circles under his eyes and his worn expression betrayed the mental strain he'd been under. "Thank you for coming." Jonathan's voice was shaky with an almost uncontrollable nervousness, as if every word was a struggle. "I don't know what else to do." Gabriel gave a slight nod, saying nothing, and Jonathan quickly led them to his car, driving toward the villa. The villa was located on the edge of a tranquil forest, its exterior classical and elegant, making it hard to believe it could be the source of such horrors. Yet the moment Ethan stepped out of the car, he felt a chill in the air. Despite the afternoon sun shining on the villa's walls, the place exuded an unnatural coldness, filling him with unease. "This is where it all began," Jonathan said as they entered the grand living room. The servants first complained of strange shadows and whispers at night. "I didn't believe them until the nightmares began." Jonathan's voice trembled with fear as he continued. "Every night, the same man stands by my bed, furious, shouting that this is his house. He tries to strangle me, and I wake up choking with these." He touched his neck, revealing the faint bruises. Gabriel said nothing, simply observing every corner of the room, his fingers occasionally brushing against the tools in his bag, as if already planning how to deal with the situation. "We'll stay here tonight," Gabriel said firmly. then began preparing for what was to come. In the light of day, the villa seemed peaceful enough. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the polished floors, and for a moment, it seemed impossible that anything sinister could be lurking here. But Gabriel remained vigilant, not letting the villa's pleasant appearance deceive him. From the moment they entered, he had been quietly walking through each room, studying every corner and detail. Ethan followed closely behind. Despite the villa's outward serenity, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. There was a tension in the air, a subtle pressure that the bright afternoon sun couldn't dispel. "Looks normal enough," Ethan muttered under his breath, trying to break the silence. Gabriel didn't respond. He continued his silent inspection, carefully examining each room with quiet precision. His fingers occasionally touched the furniture or walls, sensing for something unseen, though he gave no explanation. Jonathan hovered by the door, watching them anxiously. His exhaustion and fear were written across his face, but in Gabriel's presence, he was silent. Ethan had grown used to Gabriel's quiet demeanor, but even now, questions filled his mind. What exactly was his mentor looking for? How did he sense these things? Time passed, and after thoroughly checking each room, Gabriel returned to the living room. Without a word, he signaled to Ethan that they were done for now. "We're going into town for dinner," Gabriel said simply. Ethan was surprised but didn't ask any questions. He quickly followed his mentor out the door. Jonathan looked as though he wanted to say something but knew better than to ask. He watched them leave, anxiety clear on his face. Gabriel drove them into the nearby town, which was only 10 minutes from the villa. The town was peaceful and quiet, with none of the eerie atmosphere of the villa. The scent of food from local restaurants filled the air, and Ethan's stomach growled in response. They found a small restaurant, and Gabriel ordered a simple meal, urging Ethan to eat. "You'll need your strength tonight. Eat up," Gabriel said in his usual calm tone, though there was a hint of seriousness beneath it. Ethan wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but he knew there was no point. Gabriel always had a plan, and now wasn't the time for questions. So he ate in silence, trying to suppress his growing anxiety. Tonight's mission loomed over him, and while he trusted Gabriel, he couldn't help but wonder what exactly his mentor had sensed in the villa. After dinner, they returned to the house. The night had fallen, and the warmth of the day had long since vanished. In the dark, the villa appeared far more sinister. The sense of unease that had hovered around the place earlier was now undeniable, making Ethan's pulse quicken. The chill in the air was palpable as they stepped inside. Ethan rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. Gabriel, however, remained composed, leading the way to the master bedroom where Jonathan had been tormented night after night. "You'll sleep in Jonathan's room tonight," Gabriel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had known this was coming, but now that it was real, the fear gnawed at him. "I'll be in the room with you," Gabriel continued, "but no matter what you see or hear, do not speak, do not move." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. He knew this would be a test, one he had to pass. As the night deepened, the room's atmosphere grew heavier. The air grew colder, thick with an unspoken dread. Gabriel moved quietly around the room, placing salt and wooden talismans in the corners, preparing for the encounter. "Will this stop the ghost?" Ethan whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "It will keep it at bay, for a time," Gabriel said, continuing his preparations. When everything was set, Gabriel motioned for Ethan to lie down. He himself took a position on the floor by the bed, holding a small wooden talisman and a vial of holy water. The room fell into a tense silence. "Remember," Gabriel said softly but firmly, "no matter what happens, act like you don't see anything." Ethan lay in bed, his heart racing. He closed his eyes, trying to relax, but every fiber of his being was tense. The coldness in the room seemed to press down on him, and as the minutes passed, it felt as if the darkness itself was closing in. The silence of the night was suffocating. The occasional creak of the floorboards, the rustling of the trees outside, all amplified the tension. But as time went on, Ethan's exhaustion began to overtake his fear. His eyelids grew heavy, and sleep started to pull him under. Just as he began to drift off, a sudden chill ran up his spine, jolting him awake. His body felt paralyzed, as if something was pressing down on him. His breath quickened, his pulse pounded in his ears. He knew something was wrong, but Gabriel's warning echoed in his mind. Act like you don't see it. Despite the terror building inside him, Ethan couldn't resist. Slowly, he cracked open one eye just enough to peek. A dark, shadowy figure hovered above the bed. Its face was distorted, its eyes glowing a deep red as it leaned closer to him. Its voice was a low, guttural growl, full of rage. "This is my house. You will leave." Ethan's heart raced, his hands trembling. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he forced himself to remain still, biting down on the panic rising in his throat. The air grew colder, and the figure inched closer, its presence pressing down on him like a weight. He could feel the chill of the spirit drawing nearer, suffocating him. Suddenly, Gabriel's calm voice shattered the silence. "Get back!" The spirit jerked toward Gabriel, its glowing eyes narrowing in anger. "You think you can stop me?" Gabriel stood firm, holding up the talisman. His eyes were steady, his voice strong. He began to chant, the symbols on the talisman glowing faintly, pushing back the darkness in the room. The spirit hissed and recoiled, but it didn't vanish. Instead, it grew more volatile, swirling in the air, filling the room with an oppressive energy that seemed to shake the walls. Ethan remained frozen, his body locked in place. The fear was overwhelming, but he knew if he made any move, the spirit would turn its wrath on him. The spirit's glowing eyes fixed on Ethan again. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its form shifting, preparing to strike. The villa at night was unnaturally quiet, the air heavy with a suffocating tension. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, but the faint sounds only added to the eeriness. Inside, the house was filled with silence, save for the ticking of a clock that seemed to mock the passing time, counting down to the inevitable. Gabriel had finished setting up protective measures in Jonathan's bedroom. Salt lined the corners and talismans were placed in key areas. While the setup was meant to suppress the spirit's power, Gabriel remained tight-lipped about the specifics. Ethan knew tonight's mission would pit them against the entity from Jonathan's nightmares. He had to be ready. Remember, Gabriel had reminded him, act like you don't see anything. Don't acknowledge it. Ethan lay in the bed, his nerves fraying as the darkness seemed to come alive around him. Despite his previous experience with the supernatural, this felt different. The fear was raw, more intense than anything he'd felt before. Jonathan's chilling description of the ghost echoed in his mind, the malevolent spirit that had tried to choke the life out of him night after night. "Relax." Gabriel's voice broke through the stillness, calm and reassuring. Ethan tried to relax, closing his eyes, but every muscle in his body was tense. The cold in the room grew sharper, the air thick with something unnatural. This wasn't just a drop in temperature. This was the kind of cold that came from the void between worlds. Then, faintly at first, Ethan heard it. A low whisper, like someone speaking directly into his ear. His heart raced. He knew it was here. He forced himself to obey Gabriel's instructions, to keep his eyes shut, to pretend he didn't know it was there. But every instinct screamed at him to look, to see what was lurking in the darkness. His pulse thundered in his ears. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and he felt it. Something was near. Something cold and dark hovering at the foot of the bed, inching closer. Ethan's body locked in place, a force he couldn't see holding him down. His breath became shallow, fear spiking through his chest. He tried to remain still, but his curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, cautiously, he opened one eye. Above him, hanging in the air, was the figure of a man, or what was left of him. The face was twisted, pale and grotesque, with eyes glowing a sickening red. It stared down at Ethan, its mouth moving, growling words that sent a shiver down his spine. "This is mine." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, sweat dripping down his temples. He fought the urge to scream, to run, but Gabriel's warning kept him still. The figure drifted closer, its face now inches from his own, as if it was testing him, daring him to react. The cold intensified, and Ethan could feel his breath catching in his throat as the spirit leaned in closer, its presence overwhelming. Suddenly, Gabriel's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Get back!" The spirit whipped its head around, its glowing eyes locking onto Gabriel. "You think you can stop me?" Gabriel stood tall, holding a wooden talisman etched with runes, his eyes unwavering. He began to chant, the ancient words flowing from his lips as the talisman glowed faintly, casting a dim light into the oppressive darkness. The spirit snarled, recoiling, but it didn't vanish. Instead, it grew more aggressive, its form distorting and shifting as it began to lash out. Ethan lay frozen, his heart racing. Sweat soaked his back, but he couldn't move, couldn't scream. The fear was paralyzing, gripping him like a vice. The spirit screeched in anger, lashing out toward Ethan. Gabriel moved swiftly, throwing a handful of salt toward the entity. The salt hit the spirit with a sizzle, and it let out a piercing shriek, recoiling in pain. Its form began to blur and dissipate, but it wasn't gone. It reappeared in the far corner of the room, gathering its strength. The room fell into an eerie silence, but the oppressive presence remained. Ethan's body finally relaxed, but the relief was short-lived as the spirit manifested once more, this time with a weapon. A long, black whip formed from the shadows themselves. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the black shadow reappeared, holding a whip of pure darkness. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the whip as it cracked through the air, a tangible embodiment of the spirit's rage. His body was still numb from the earlier paralysis, but he could feel his muscles twitching, desperate to move. "Don't move, Ethan." Gabriel's voice was calm but commanding, slicing through the panic. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay still, but he felt the spirit's attention shift toward him. It was sizing him up, preparing to strike. The whip snapped through the air, and in an instant, it lashed across Ethan's chest. The pain was excruciating, like fire searing through his skin. Even though there were no visible marks, the sensation burrowed deep into his bones. He could barely keep himself from crying out, his body drenched in cold sweat. Without hesitation, Gabriel sprang into action. From his belt, he pulled out a glowing rope, a soul tether inscribed with protective runes. The rope shimmered faintly, glowing in the dim light as Gabriel readied it. "You picked the wrong target," Gabriel said, his voice low and full of resolve. With a quick motion, he hurled the soul tether at the spirit. The rope flew through the air in a graceful arc, wrapping itself around the spirit's form. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream, thrashing violently as the tether tightened. Black smoke poured from its body as it writhed, struggling to break free. Ethan lay on the bed, struggling to breathe. The pain still pulsed through his body, but now he could move. Slowly, he pushed himself up, though his limbs were still weak from the agony. He knew the battle wasn't over yet. The spirit continued to thrash, its glowing eyes burning with fury. "You think you can bind me?" It howled, its voice a distorted echo of rage. Gabriel remained silent, chanting softly. The words, ancient and powerful, reverberated through the room, causing the soul tether to tighten further. The spirit's form began to flicker, its presence growing weaker with every passing second. But the ghost wasn't done yet. With one final surge of anger, it raised the shadow whip, aiming directly at Gabriel. The whip cracked through the air, speeding toward Gabriel's chest. At the last moment, Gabriel raised his talisman, blocking the blow. The whip collided with the talisman, sending out a shockwave of energy, but it bounced off, unable to pierce through Gabriel's defenses. The spirit let out another furious scream, recoiling once more. Ethan watched the battle unfold, his heart racing. Gabriel's power and precision were far beyond anything he had seen before. Even in the face of such a terrifying spirit, Gabriel remained composed, using his tools and knowledge to suppress the entity's strength. "It's time for the final step," Gabriel said softly, his voice calm but resolute. From his bag, Gabriel pulled out a small, seemingly ordinary cloth pouch, its surface covered in intricate runes. The spirit howled in rage as if sensing its impending doom. Its form trembled violently, the red eyes glowing brighter with fear and fury. Gabriel opened the pouch, his chanting growing louder, filling the room with a strange energy. With a swift motion, he flung the soul tether, dragging the spirit toward the pouch. The ghost let out one final shriek, its voice filled with despair and hatred as it was pulled into the pouch. As the last echo of the spirit's cry faded, the room fell silent. The temperature began to rise, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if the spirit's presence had never existed. Ethan collapsed onto the bed, his body still trembling from the ordeal. The sweat on his skin cooled in the now peaceful air. Gabriel stood over him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly. "The spirit is sealed." Ethan nodded weakly. The pain still lingered, but he knew they had won. This battle had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, and though he had survived, it was clear how much he still had to learn. "This is the work of a hunter," Gabriel said, his voice calm and steady. Morning light filtered through the thick curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. The cold, oppressive air from the night before had vanished, replaced by a calm stillness. It almost felt like everything that had happened the previous night was a dream, but Ethan knew all too well it was real. He sat up slowly, his body still sore, though the pain had subsided considerably. He touched the places where the ghost's whip had lashed out, finding no physical marks, but the memory of the pain was still fresh in his mind. Gabriel was already awake, standing by the window, quietly packing up his tools. The cloth pouch containing the spirit was sealed tight, its runes glowing faintly. Though the ghost was trapped, the room still carried an air of tension. "How are you feeling?" Gabriel asked, his voice calm as always, as if the night's events were just another routine job. "Better," Ethan replied with a weak smile. "But last night, that was terrifying." Gabriel nodded, his gaze shifting back to the window. "That spirit was powerful, but it wasn't the worst we'll face." His voice was low and steady, as though he were preparing Ethan for the future. "You have to understand, being a hunter means facing things far worse than ghosts." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He glanced down at his arm, still remembering the intense fear from the night before. He knew if Gabriel hadn't been there, he wouldn't have stood a chance. "We captured it, right?" Ethan asked, his voice unsure as he glanced at the pouch in Gabriel's hand. "Yes," Gabriel confirmed. "It's sealed for now, but we'll need to perform a proper cleansing ritual to ensure it can never return." Ethan nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. Though the ghost was trapped, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The world of hunting was far more dangerous and complex than he had realized. Every spirit, every demon, carried powers beyond human understanding, and he had only just begun to scratch the surface. "You did well last night," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice carrying a hint of praise, something rare for him. Ethan looked up, surprised. Despite knowing he had barely made it through the night, those words filled him with a small sense of pride. "But don't think you're ready," Gabriel added, his tone turning serious once more. "That ghost was just one of many enemies you'll face. The ones waiting for us will be stronger, more dangerous. You must always be prepared." Ethan nodded again, understanding the weight of Gabriel's words. Last night's victory had only been the beginning, and the real dangers were still out there, waiting for them. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, warming Ethan's face as he slowly opened his eyes. The physical pain from the night before had nearly faded, but the memories of the encounter were still vivid in his mind. Though his body felt better, the psychological weight of the experience lingered. Ethan sat up in bed, rubbing his arms where the ghost's whip had struck him. There were no visible marks, but the sensation was still fresh. Across the room, Gabriel was already awake, quietly packing away the tools from the ritual. The cloth pouch containing the spirit sat on the table, its runes glowing faintly. Though the spirit was sealed, the air still carried a trace of unease, a reminder that the job wasn't over yet. "The pain's gone," Ethan said, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. Gabriel glanced at him, then turned back to his work. The damage wasn't physical. Spirits don't leave scars on the body. They go after the mind, the soul. Ethan nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The previous night had been a brutal reminder of how unprepared he was for the world of hunting. He had survived, but only barely. There was still so much he didn't understand. "The ghost won't come back, right?" Ethan asked, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. "Not for now," Gabriel replied, "but that doesn't mean you should relax. We still need to complete the ritual to make sure it stays gone." Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of the previous night's events pressing down on him. The world of hunting was far more dangerous than he had imagined, and last night had only been a glimpse of what lay ahead. "You did well," Gabriel said, breaking the silence. His voice carried a rare tone of approval. Ethan blinked, surprised. Gabriel rarely gave praise, and even though Ethan knew he hadn't been perfect, the compliment still brought a small sense of satisfaction. "But don't get complacent," Gabriel added, his tone firm. "This was just the beginning. What we faced last night is nothing compared to what's out there. You need to be ready for much worse." Ethan nodded, feeling the gravity of Gabriel's words. He knew the real challenges were still ahead. Later that evening, Gabriel and Ethan completed the final cleansing ritual. Afterward, they packed up their tools and arranged to meet Jonathan Blake at a quiet cafe in the nearby town to give him the final report. Jonathan rushed into the cafe, still looking anxious despite the news that the spirit had been dealt with. His eyes darted around the room nervously before he spotted Gabriel and Ethan. "Is it really over?" Jonathan asked, his voice shaky with lingering fear. Gabriel nodded. "The spirit has been sealed, and the cleansing ritual is complete. But you should understand, the villa still carries traces of the spiritual energy. We've dealt with the immediate threat, but it's best to remain vigilant." Jonathan seemed to relax slightly, though the worry hadn't completely left his face. "Thank you for everything you've done. I'll make sure to keep the house protected." "You'll need to," Gabriel said seriously. "Keep the place spiritually clean, and don't let any outside forces disturb the peace we've restored." Jonathan nodded quickly, thanking them again before leaving the cafe. The cafe grew quiet once more, the soft evening light filtering through the windows. Ethan stared out into the street, lost in thought. He knew he was on the path of a hunter now, but the experience of the previous night had made him think more deeply about what lay ahead. "Gabriel," Ethan said after a long pause, "when does this end? Does the work ever stop?" Gabriel was silent for a moment, his gaze lingering on the setting sun outside. Finally, he spoke softly. "There's no end to this. We keep fighting, keep pushing back the darkness. That's all we can do." Ethan nodded, the weight of those words settling in. He knew now that there was no turning back. As they left the cafe and walked through the quiet streets, Ethan realized just how much he still had to learn. The road ahead would be long, filled with greater dangers and deeper darkness. But he had chosen this path, and now he would have to face whatever lay in wait. Thank you so much for watching episode 2 of The Apprentice and the Hunter. We hope you enjoyed the suspense and thrills of this haunted villa story. Your support means the world to us. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with friends who love horror, and subscribe for more chilling adventures with Ethan and Gabriel. There are many more terrifying encounters ahead, and we can't wait for you to experience them with us. Until next time, keep your eyes open, but don't always trust what you see in the dark.